Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you've had a great week. It's Friday afternoon, and getting this teaching video out to you ahead of our Simple Church gatherings on Sunday, this coming 10 a.m. to about 11:15, with coffee fellowship outside under the front awning, and if the weather's good, and even if it's not so good, the awning's there to help us. But we should have a couple 2 or 3 weeks, or maybe hopefully a month of decent weather ahead of us as fall proceeds. So hope you're all doing well. And let's just get into the preparation for our discussions on Sunday here. So I'll share screen with you, and I'll take a look at a few announcements, and then I'll get into our teaching on First Peter. Um, just real quickly, again, a few of the standard things here. We'll be praying together on Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. on Zoom. So a link usually goes out to that, and email. Continue to check email. Email tends to be the easiest and most direct way to be in contact with most of you. So check your spam from time to time. You may not be getting things. And if you're not getting emails, just contact me personally. Text me or Facebook message, whatever you need to do. I want to make sure you're getting those communications. Predominantly, I'm using Facebook Messenger and email to be in touch with you all. And then within your simple churches, your leaders and those amongst you in those simple churches can use text messaging and things like that. It's tough for me to do text messaging to everybody, but Facebook and email has formed a good platform for that. And then Thursday night, we'll continue our video series on angels and cherubim in the spiritual being series of the Bible Project. So jump in on that. Even if you haven't been a part of it before, they're all sort of standalone, and we pull in and think, repeat some of the ideas that we've talked in previous videos. But those videos are always available to you to watch on YouTube, and they're just a great time of conversation and opportunity for discussion. Our goal here is really to not only to learn from these videos, but be able to use them as tools to talk about the story of the Bible with other people. And you can share it. You can sit down over lunch or a break or whatever with friends and family, and have conversations about these things. So it's a time of equipping you to really not only grasp the story of the Bible for yourselves through the windows of these different themes or these different elements, but be able to have conversations with others. So that's the way I think about it, and I've designed this as an equipping way of learning. So I hope you'll take advantage of that. And we are continuing to use our YouTube channel for particularly these videos that I'm posting, as well as a playlist that Jonathan posts that he's selected for the particular Sunday, so that you can watch those on your own. We draw from those in our Simple Church gatherings, one or two of those songs, just in this time where we can't really get together and sing and make music. We can at least do that in our hearts and on our devices, and utilize that when we're together, and even share them with one another. So feel free to shoot a link to Jonathan if you have a favorite song or something spoken to your heart that week. Love to integrate that stuff there as well. We'll continue to meet together in person with the masking and the cleaning that we're doing. So appreciate all the effort that you're putting into loving one another, and just doing our part in contributing to the well-being of the whole of society right now. And I think that's what Jesus would have us do. We're going to continue to meet in these simple churches, these four groups that are meeting across the campus on Sunday mornings, on this basically every other Sunday with the exception of the first Sunday of the month. So coming up here on October 4th, I believe it is, we'll all meet together in the auditorium. We need to do that once a month just to be reminded that we're part of the larger group, and sort of the unique dynamic that creates. But we're trying to balance that with the relationships and the discussion and the learning that we can only do together with masks on and social distancing in smaller groups of people. So my concern is that If we were to meet in the auditorium every Sunday, it would become a very passive environment with one person speaking and everybody sitting and listening. And that's not Christ's plan for the church. Christ's plan for the church is that we not only worship together, but we think together, and then we act together and encourage one another in that. And so the combination of being reminded of our larger church family, but engaging with one another in the smaller church families, if you will, or simple churches, is, I think, a good balance, and we're going to keep that through the beginning of next year, so January 3rd. So this is going to be our pattern as we move forward. And if for some reason things change and we have to back up and can't be meeting physically anymore, we've already got the structure to go online with Zoom and to maintain the contact in those smaller, simple churches. So that's where we're going. And as you see, I've highlighted there, we're trying to keep this pattern of teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer as part of our habits as we go through this unique time. And the breaking of bread is something that we may do in one of the Sundays where we're gathered together, just as we were outside. We may designate one Sunday where you bring your bread in a cup and a snack or something, that we did in the summer, and we break bread together. But only one of the Sundays. We won't do that each week, just for the cleaning up that might cause, and the extra challenge that is, because we are having the fellowship time outside. So I'll keep you informed about that, how we're going to go about that, because we do need to do that regularly too, and we've gotten in the habit of doing that. I think everyone's enjoyed it. So I've titled this series At Home with God. Introduced it to you last week through the video, Bible Project video on 1 Peter. We've talked a lot about Paul, and we tend to focus a lot on Paul. A lot of his teaching is there in the New Testament, but Peter is one of the key apostles and the pillars of the church. And as I was studying and reading through this letter a couple of weeks ago, it struck me that there's really a lot to wrestle with here and to think about together. So, and it just so happens that the plan I've laid out is going to take us exactly to the in parallel to the plan that we've laid out for meeting in this way. So through January 3rd, this lays out a plan. So maybe something of God's divine encouragement in all of that. But I wanted to start today with the beginning of the letter in 1 Peter 1:1-2, where we get familiar with this new home. Think about Peter's describing a home that we live in now with God, that we've been invited. We didn't know about it before, but we found out about it through the gospel, and we're learning to live within it, even while we're living in sort of unoccupied or occupied territory with an enemy among us. In terms of a conflict. And Peter's letter is packed with a lot of different themes and key aspects of the apostles' teaching addressed to these letters in the northern part of Asia Minor that day, and you see that in a minute. So my goal here in this series is to immerse ourselves in the apostles' teaching, to learn to read these letters with the historical context in mind and the design pattern of the letter, to become clear and unified on the author's intended meaning, and then think together in wisely applying and implementing its significance in our continuing task today of being God's people for our contemporary world. How can we take the things that were written to those people in that time and work through their significance for us today, and then live in a way that is rooted in those things? That's our task always as a church. That's not just something that I do in giving information to you, or a nice inspirational thought, but it's something that we do together as a community to wrestle with these things, and then figure out how, through prayer and through discussion and through the leading of God's Spirit, how we can go about living our lives in a way that would reflect what was being taught to the early believers. Here's the design pattern that the Bible Project video laid out for 1 Peter, and I'm going to follow it simply because I introduced this to you. And so we'll follow this design pattern and unpack it in our weekly teaching and discussions when we get together. So become familiar with that video on 1 Peter and the transcript I gave you as well. Probably in the links below this video or in the emails that I send out to you. I'm going to send you a copy today of just the text of First Peter. No capitals, numbers, no verse numbers, no headings, no titles, just the text, so that you can begin to read through it and make notes yourself of where there's a change in thought, where there's a word that notes a transition, things like that. I encourage you to do that. This letter takes anywhere from 17 to 20 minutes to read. You could read through it several times in an hour likely and begin to see some of the design pattern of it. And that's what we want to look for, because an author uses that intentionally. It's written carefully, inspired by God, but through a human author to communicate key ideas and concepts in a particular way. And so that's what we have to do that work carefully, as also well as understand the background and the story about where this, what this letter is doing, who is it addressed to, and who's it coming from. And that's what you see somewhat here in the upper left-hand portion of their poster there. So the video itself gives you a little bit of background in that. It'll take us through year end to the first Sunday in January. This series will be, and I'd encourage all of you to commit to mastering this teaching together through reading, reflection, discussion. In other words, we want to live with this for a while, and that is what really important. That we live with the matter. We do that in the way that we approach first principles in the study and the preparation that we do. I'm always concerned if you're walking in on a Sunday and you haven't done anything in preparation for our discussion time. So I ask you to commit to being prepared ahead of time, watching these videos, reading, doing the kinds of things. I guarantee you, with God's Spirit's help, you will come to know and understand things, and it'll change you. Some of the things that you can do too are take notes, develop convictions, make decisions, plans, keep a journal, a notebook, whatever you need to do to not let good ideas get lost. And that's often what happens. Don't be passive, be active in your own spiritual development. That's your task. And our task, my task particularly, is to equip you to take action on these things. And but that means your involvement as well. And take time to discuss this with family after a meal or together with your spouse or with your kids, very briefly. It doesn't have to be anything major, but just enter it into conversation. What did you think about the video? What did you think about the passage here? Make that a habit that you begin to develop. I'm always concerned about what we're doing throughout the week between Sundays, because that's really telling us to where our commitment to and our following after Christ is. Not Sunday. We don't measure our lives by what we do on Sunday. We measure our lives by what we do throughout the course of the week. That is the really telling story. So I encourage you in that way. And encourage one another. And I said, even with a poke. In other words, ask a provocative question of someone. Hey, are you reading? Are you? This seems to be something that you really need to think about. And I say that especially in your families, fathers to kids, and moms to kids, and husbands to wives, vice versa, wives to husbands. But perhaps you have a special relationship with someone in the church, among you men or among you ladies, that you make this the subject matter of some of your conversation with one another. So I encourage you in that always, but that's something that we could do in this. A little context of the Christian letters from a commentary on that here. You see that there. This little series, the Everyone series, is a great addition to your Bible for all of you. I encourage you all. It's written in very popular, common language and very first principles like in some ways. So it's a good resource to have. But Wright says in this commentary, introducing the letters, of which First Peter is a part, First and Second Peter, the early Christian letters, or the Jewish apostolic literature, we like to think of them as, are short, sharp, and to the point. They are full of clear, practical advice for Christians taking their early steps in the faith and needing to know where their problems were going to come and what resources they could find to cope with them. But they also breathe the fresh air of delight in a newfound faith, hope, and life. They are full of wonder at the fact of Jesus himself at what he'd done in giving his life to rescue people, at what he had revealed about who God himself is. They are realistic in facing the dangers a Christian community will meet in the world around, trying to squash the church into its ways of life and to stifle the rumor that the living God might be on the loose. That's an interesting way of saying it. And they are equally realistic in highlighting difficulties which may arise within the community itself. They draw richly on the ancient scriptures of Israel to help give the young Christians that all-important sense of depth in discovering who they really are within God's love and purposes, and they range widely across issues of everything from politics to private life. They are a vital resource for every church and every Christian. So a way to think about and understand these general letters from the apostles outside of Paul's letters, of which Peter's letters are a part. And I highlighted this part in blue simply because think about from Peter's perspective. Peter had been one who had spent time with Jesus and knew him personally and had been there at the events at the end of Jesus' earthly life and seen the resurrected Jesus. And one of the ways to understand the apostles, particularly here in Peter's case, is quite often we start with, and we Westerners and moderns are probably more in danger of this than others, but I think it may be a human characteristic. We start in our mind with an image of God, who we think God is, and then we try to figure out if Jesus fits the bill for that, or if Jesus fits into that concept, and that's backwards. That is not the way it works. The apostles, and particularly the gospel writers, Peter's gospel is really revealed in Mark. Mark is a student of Peter, so if you want to understand Peter's story about Jesus, read the Gospel of Mark. What they're saying is, if you want to know who God is, look at Jesus first. That's the God of the Bible right there. And that's where you need to formulate your perceptions of who God is. Not come with those perceptions and then try to figure out if Jesus fits that or not. That's not the way it works. And often other religions comparing themselves to Christians do that. For us, you look at Jesus first and you say, that's who God is. And everything else about God is summed up in him, Old and New Testament. So just a word of advice as you encounter this and think about it from the perspective of our lives today and what it means to understand who God is. You got to look to Jesus first, not come with a preconceived notion of what we think that looks like. Peter's letter is written to churches in this area of Asia Minor, Bithynia, Pontus, you see there, Galatia, Cappadocia, Cilicia, and Peter's writing to people who have probably of Jewish background and also of pagan background who have become followers of Jesus and been formed into communities, local churches, who are now at odds with the culture around them by giving their allegiance to this one God alone, revealed in the Old Testament initially, but fully revealed in Jesus and the work of his Spirit now in the world of their time. So that's brought a lot of pressure on them and set them at odds with the culture around them. And certainly that is sort of part of the background of our lives today. We're in a similar state of living in a world that doesn't give its allegiance to Jesus, his Father, and devoted to his Spirit or led by his Spirit. But that's where we are, and we need to learn to live in that kind of world and in a way, hopefully, that turns some back to the true God that we know in Jesus. Let me go through these real quick. We'll see those later. But as you were to read over this letter, and I encourage you to do that, again, I'll just send you just the text. Take you anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes to read through all 5 chapters of 1 Peter. What's Peter saying in a nutshell? Read it through again, and then just in your own mind or on a piece of paper, whatever you need to do, what's Peter saying? What is this about? That's a great exercise to begin to understand what Peter, as the divinely inspired author here, is doing and trying to communicate to those people and those churches in that time. So I encourage you to do that, and to do that as often as you can. You will develop a skill in being able to handle God's Word by approaching it in this way, reading through the whole letter and asking yourself what it's about and what is Peter saying here. and trying to summarize that in your own words will transform you, will deepen your understanding and make you attentive to, aware of other things as you're reading across the scriptures. So here's what we want to look at today, this introduction. This letter is from Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ. I'm writing to God's chosen people who are living as foreigners in the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. That map that I was just showing you there. God the Father knew you and chose you long ago, and his Spirit has made you holy. As a result, you have obeyed him and have been cleansed by the blood of Jesus Christ. May God give you more and more grace and peace. So really everything that Peter wants to talk about in this letter is packed into this here. So I want to begin to unpack it a little bit and set the stage for what we're going to see in the weeks to come as we unfold these ideas little by little. I'm using the New Living translation, so be aware of that. I've just enjoyed the simplicity of its language, and we'll work from that as a base. We use the ESV quite often when we're together. Continue to use whatever version you like, but you'll see me using the New Living translation here in English. And I think it also helps for those who are not as familiar with English as their number one language, their mother tongue. So this also helps in conversations with others, I think, as well around us in our situation. So some of the core things Peter's doing here, he's setting the tone, the stage, or the framework for all he wants to say to the churches in the beginning here. They're all kind of tightly packed, so you might read through that and say, okay, what are those all? What are all those things? And all that's happening to them setting in this stage setting is part of God's purpose for them and for the world, even difficulty and suffering. That becomes more apparent as you read the letter. His teaching also is rooted in the hope that finds its foundation in the good news of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And their hope should be in that as well. So that's set in this stage here. It's about Jesus' sacrifice, and it's about Jesus, their delight in him and what he's done for them. That is the grounding of their hope. So we need to approach it with that understanding as well. And Peter will develop all these things later in the letter as he is writing. He just sort of is introducing them all, a whole lot of things that are packed into these first two verses that he's going to unfold as we read through the letter and study it carefully together. The first question that might come to your mind, though, is what does it mean to be God's chosen people? This language that Peter uses, chosen for what and according to what precedent? I'll leave that as one of the questions, or the second of the questions that you can discuss on Sunday at the Simple Churches, alongside what you think this whole book is about after reading through it. But this is a tricky idea because it looks like that God's playing favorites here, or that there's this idea that God is predetermined that this group of people is going to be part of his people and these people are not, and that brings up some strange questions and strange issues to think about. But the problem is whenever we come to try to formulate a doctrine or formulate an idea about sort of a universal truth or a universal principle, and most often they're just statements of truth about what the Bible is talking about, we've got to be very, very careful that we're not creating something outside of the story. Think about doctrines, think about core beliefs as suitcases that have a story packed inside of them. Now, you only see the suitcase, and the suitcase is easy to carry around with you, but when you open it up, it's very, very clear, oh, you've been here or you're planning to go there. The contents of the suitcase will tell the story about where you've been or where you're going because you prepared for that, but it's all contained in this little box that you carry around with you. Think about doctrines in that way. They're understood and they're fully understood and clarified when they're unpacked and what's inside of it. We don't carry a suitcase around because we admire suitcases, and we use suitcases to distinguish ourselves. We use them for a purpose of understanding and carrying around a lot of other things within them that we need. And they don't, doctrines and propositional truths don't stand apart from that larger context. The story gives shape to them. So they're little stories condensed into one statements, but you can't leave them at that. You've got to unpack the full story, and that's what this chosen people idea is all about. It's a way of shortening and talking about a story, and obviously the main story we get beginning in Genesis 12 is God choosing a group of people for His larger purposes. And the idea of being a chosen people and being a holy people is not to receive a special status in the world. It's to have a special task in the world and a special purpose in the world. That's what God's intention for Israel was that through them He would bless all families of the earth, bless all the nations. So they were chosen for a purpose, and they were set aside and given a unique set of principles and a unique covenant and a unique lifestyle that was meant to point everyone to their God, who also was the God of the nations and would eventually draw the nations to Himself. The commentary on the early letters goes on to say this is God's purpose to set people aside from other uses so they can be signposts to this new reality. There's what being chosen is about. It's not for special isolated status and everybody else, is doomed. It's so that through this particular group of people, everyone else can get in on the blessing or the story as well. This new world has in fact already come into being through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus the Messiah. Though through that sacrificial death on the one hand and the indwelling of God's Spirit on the other, God has set people apart to be living signals of this new world. Therefore, to be holy, both in the technical sense that God has set them apart for this purpose, and in the practical sense that their actual lives have been transformed. Those go together. A special purpose and living in a way that demonstrates that purpose is at work in you, and you're fully on board with that. So this is the way in which we not only come into God's new family, but once we're in that family, we need to learn to live in a way that's in accordance with that family, that's consistent with that family. The way they behave now reflects God's desire for His human creatures. That, however daunting and unlikely it seems, is who we are as Christians. So it's a bit mysterious in the sense that it's not a mechanical thing here, but the idea of being set aside and chosen, keep in mind a special task, a special purpose, with a unique identity for a larger task that God has created for us as His people, just like He had did for Israel, and which was eventually fulfilled in Jesus. Jesus did what Israel failed to do in God's calling for them, and in doing so represented them and also brought about the purpose for which God had called Israel, so that His good news could go out into the nations and they could be part of His work. That's what we see unfolding in the Gospels and in the book of Acts, and as Paul and the apostles and Peter in this case go out into the world and say, you're now fully part of the family because of what Jesus has done. And Jesus has done that because He came from Israel, God's special people, and in essence became the spearhead, or the Israel narrowed down to one man, one person who was also God Himself, come to do what His people had failed to do. But now, through His work and through the work of His Spirit in you, you are fully capable of being that people for the sake of those that are not there yet. It's always for this larger purpose that a special calling is created. So here they're dual citizens. They're living in particular places of the world. He mentions those places while sharing in the global reality, or might even say the cosmic reality, of the new creation launched by Jesus. So the dual citizens, they grew up in that place. They're from there. They speak that language. But at the same time, they have an identity that links them to other people in other places that's rooted in God's work and God's purposes in Jesus and by His Spirit. They're set apart for special use, like Israel was, only now through the work of Jesus and by His Spirit, this renewed partnership, which includes all the nations, the good news that's going out because of Jesus. The letter will spell out what this special use is. So what does it look like to be the special people? That's part of what that letter is going to unfold and call them to, and is for us today. Their purpose is to loyally follow Jesus and live in the uniqueness of His sacrifices. In other words, they really believe this. They have to really, really fully grasp and understand what God has done for them and called them to, and live out this special purpose together, even when it's in conflict with the world around them, which will become apparent in the letter. What they need above all else is to live in the delight and favor of Jesus. That's another way to think about His grace, God's delight and favor to lavish and to pour out His love and His blessing and His and well-being on others. And the well-being. And well-being is another way of saying peace, not just lack of conflict, but overall well-being. All is well. And those things are needed, grace and peace. May grace and peace be yours in abundance, Peter says. That's, in the end, that's one of the greatest wishes you can have in a world that's at odds with God's people. You need grace and peace. Pray for yourself, grace and peace, living each and every day, living and working around those who are not part of God's family. That's what you need in order to be this special people. It's not of your own power, not of your own strength, not of your own will. It's out of the grace and peace that God gives. And so that's what we need to pray for. That's what Peter's praying for them. We need that in a superabundance in the midst of the world as it currently is. And just look at our day and our time. We'll talk about that. So as you read this opening of the letter, what are you expecting to learn more about? What do you think will be clarified as you move forward? Talk about that on Sunday. What are some of the things that you want to see unpack some more? What's your understanding of them right now from this initial reading of verse 1 and 2? Be prepared to talk about that on Sunday, and we'll understand these things together, as I said, throughout the year end. So a summary thought for you here, and just in terms of this opening portion of the letter, that for us we can think about its significance in this way. We're part of a much larger home. I've called this series "At Home with God." Our eyes have been awakened to a larger reality than the one that we're born into or that we see in the world around us. We're part of a much larger home and purpose for it than we or our culture could ever carve out for us. There's so much. Our lives are so much greater, part of so much greater thing than anything our own families, our education, our culture, our nationality could give to us. We're part of something much grander, much greater, that those things have meaning within or have purpose within. Because of Jesus' work and the work of His Spirit, we are set apart for a greater purpose, one which has been secured by Jesus Himself, has its roots in Him, and summons us to loyal following together, even while living in occupied territory. Being at home while in occupied territory. Think about that image, almost like a wartime image. What does it look like to be a citizen of a country that's under occupation, knowing that's your home, but yet there is conflict around you. We need special help from God in this, grace and peace in this case, and a readiness to understand and live as if at home with Him in every circumstance. There is no exception for the calling of God's people, no matter when and no matter where that they live. That's why this applies to us. This was not just written to them in the first century. It was also written for us in the 21st, in our particular time, in this particular place, with the particular things that are going on right now. And that needs to guide us. We cannot relegate these things to just a historical lesson or something that was way back then. But this is still part of an informing, founding teaching for what it means for us today, and how we are to continue to live in God's purpose, because those purposes have not yet come to completion. Jesus has not returned again, but He is risen from the dead and will return. And so again, we live in the poles of those two things. So continue to keep this prayer. I've taught you this Jesus prayer, which is an ancient one, many, many times, praying to our triune God. Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, set up your kingdom in our midst. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Holy Spirit, breath of the living God, renew me and all the world. Meditate and reflect and think about that. Let these purposes of God, as He's revealed Himself to us, just draw your attention and your spirit towards Him, especially as we look at the direction that we get from Peter in this letter as well. So that gives you an introduction and things to consider before we get together on Sunday. So look forward to seeing you all then, and may the Lord bless your week and your life in Him and with one another, and continue to pray for one another. And the Lord bless you through the rest of the weekend until we're together. And I'd pray that for you all in Jesus' name.